My name is David Carter and I'm one of the Signs of Safety and Practice Development Officers in Cumbria County Council. The purpose of this presentation today is to give you an overview of signs of safety and the practice methodology, but more specifically to give you an overview of signs of wellbeing success, which will underpin the new early help assessment, which goes live 1st of September 2020. I'd like to introduce you to the signs of wellbeing mapping, which will underpin the early help assessment and our approach to assessment when working with children and families in early help. And I hope it really supports this implementation to the changes in the early help assessment. Thank you.
So our vision in Cumbria is that we believe the best place for children and young people to grow up is within their own families and networks where they've got the potential to care for them safely. And when that's not possible, we're going to provide a secure and stable home to help them achieve their full potential. So this is obviously in line with the local authority or the council plan, where we're focusing our resources on the most vulnerable children and young people, supporting our communities to thrive, prevention and early intervention, and managing the demand on the service. Just to go over the Ofsted feedback, we had a visit from Ofsted in August 2019, and what came out of that was their acknowledgement that signs of safety was beginning to be evident right the way through the whole service. If I just read out that statement, it says the local authority's preferred model of social work is well embedded and its influence is evident at every level, from the strategic to the operational. It helps to shape the way in which social workers think and practice. It provides a common language to use with other professionals. It is also used positively to engage parents and families, enabling them to share in the evaluation of risks and concerns about their children and supporting them to make the changes needed to improve children's outcomes. So what they were talking about was signs of safety or the practice methodology being evident right the way from the front door, right the way through the whole service. Obviously the purpose of this presentation today is to think about a little bit before that, the front door, when we're talking about early help and some of those preventative services. But the feedback in terms of the implementation thus far is really positive. So what we hope to see that is not only every level from the front door but beyond, so going down into early help right from the initial contact where we initially meet or have a conversation with somebody who needs some kind of support. We're using the signs of safety or signs of wellbeing and success practice methodology. Just to go over the practice bottom lines in Cumbria, we had some practice bottom lines. What that means is there were some absolute rules, if you like, or some absolute agreements in terms of practice, what we expected to see on every case that was coming through our service. We said that every new child in need and child protection case from the 1st of April, these bottom lines will be evident. However, unfortunately, due to COVID-19, that was postponed somewhat, so there's a plan to re-implement those bottom lines in the coming weeks. But we expect to see genograms on all cases that are developed with families. One of the practice bottom lines of signs of safety is that we use networks, that actually it's the family and networks plan, not our plan. So it's very important that some of those initial conversations at all levels of the service, whether it be social care, early help, is around it, identifying who's around that family, who's in their immediate family, extended family, their friendship network and the community that can support them. So we try to complete genograms at the earliest opportunity and start having those conversations around meaningful support people, which leads on to having a naturally occurring safety or wellbeing network, and they're involved in the safety planning. What this means is that rather than a network being on the periphery, they're involved in the planning from the onset, so they will be invited to meetings, they will be invited to contribute to planning, they will be invited to give their ideas and their thoughts, they will be asked scaling questions, etc. So we need to involve the safety network at the earliest opportunity. In social work we have danger statements, safety goals and safety scales, and these are shared with and understood by families. So any statements we make about families aren't done to them, so I wouldn't go away and formulate a statement and then I deliver it to the family saying this is my statement about you. what I would say is this is a draft statement that I've come up with. How does that feel to you? And try to get the family in the network to start taking ownership of this statement, because then it becomes theirs. So I'm not doing two, I'm working with families. We need to complete direct work with children that's linked to the worries and informing planning. So if we have generated the danger statement and a safety goal, it's very clear and specific about what the worries are and what success would look like, or what it would look like when we're no longer worried. So the direct work is tailored specifically towards those worries, which are very clear in the statements. We're completing trajectory and timelines, giving clarity and focus to work. What that means is we say piece by piece or week by week what's going to happen, when and by whom. What this does is create a vision of hope for children and families. So if we're working towards a safety goal, we try and have it on a piece of paper, for example, that they can maybe stick on the back of the fridge, what's going to happen and by whom each week by week up until we reach the safety goal. Safety planning needs to be solution focused, with family-led rules about how safety is created. So rather than us imposing our rules based on our hypotheses or our view of the situation, we try and support families and work in partnership with families to come up with their own rules about how safety is going to be created. Because we know if we impose rules on families and they don't buy into those or necessarily believe in the value of those, then there may be a situation where we withdraw our services and they revert back to the initial behaviour, because they haven't bought into those rules, because they haven't been made by themselves, if you like. So what we try to do is work with families to ask them what they think their rules should be in order for us to feel that we no longer need to be worried. And we're going to have a new child protection case conference agenda, and this will also have an emphasis on networks. So whether it be a social worker, whether it be a third sector worker, whether it be an early help worker, it's for everybody to know that networks will be a focus in child protection conferences. So they're going to start looking slightly differently. So traditionally we might have had maybe mum on her own, or maybe mum and dad, or etc, etc. However, what we're trying to evolve child protection conferences into look much more heavily involvement of family and networks. So there'll be less professionals and more network, because going back to when we said it's families' plans and they come up with the rules, then actually they're the most important people that need to be there. So we will see the format of child protection conferences change over the coming months. So why signs of safety, or why signs of well-being? We've adopted this practice approach in Cumbria because we know that it's better outcomes for children. Evidence tells us that, and research tells us that if we have meaningful conversations with children and really get down to the specific issues and engage them in meaningful conversations around that, then we can do some meaningful positive work with them and reach better outcomes. It's a child-centred culture. It's very much focused on the voice of the child, where the child's voice is used in planning in the true sense of the word. So rather than gathering the child's voice and it not really doing anything, it's just standing alone, we actually incorporate it into the plan, and the plan's governed or led by that child's voice. There's long-lasting positive changes for families, and we know this, that sustainability, because if it's a family plan and then we withdraw ourselves or our support or our services, the family plan still exists, because it's the family and the network that are coordinating an action in that plan. So we know that it's much more sustainable working in this way. We want to have a consistent practice approach for all workers in Cumbria, and that's despite the level of the service. So as mentioned earlier, right the way from the onset where there's any initial contact with the family, right the way through early help into social work teams and beyond, we need to have a consistent language and a consistent practice approach, so families experience the same service despite what level of the service that they're at. It builds a strengths-based workforce, and this is around shifting our focus, so we're not focusing on the deficits or the things that are wrong, we're focusing on everything that's going right, and trying to build on strengths, because we know that nothing more can be gained from looking at everything that's going wrong, but actually if we focus on the things that are going right and trying to build on those and strengthen those, then actually we're seeing some really positive changes. So it's working in a strengths-based, solution-focused way. And it does improve job satisfaction. When speaking to workers who have been using signs of safety or signs of wellbeing and success, what they're saying is actually, this makes sense, it's logical. Some people saying this is the reason why I got into support work or social work in the first place, because it's really getting down to the relational work with children and families and working with them on their level, not so much focused on the paperwork, if you like, and generating reports and feeding a system. It's more focusing on the relationship with the family and making meaningful connections where we can promote safety, well-being and change. So thinking about adapting this approach then, so it's not just an approach for child protection, but signs of safety is a solution-focused, strengths-based approach to explore unique characteristics of any family and gives a comprehensive analysis of this. So signs of safety initially was designed for child protection, however over the years, because it comes from the bottom up in terms of the development of the model, they speak to workers on an ongoing basis, and what workers were saying was that signs of safety didn't necessarily fit into some other services such as early help or maybe the looked after service or some of the third sectors. So what they've done was made changes to the practice model which ensured that it fit into every person we work with, if you like. And what we say certainly when we're delivering training is that if we have an assessed need and a desired outcome or a reason why we're involved and what we're trying to achieve, then this practice methodology will fit and it will work. So the terminology can be changed. It maintains fidelity to the practice approach, but makes the approach more accessible to different service areas through the skillful use of language. And what that means is you changing some of the terminology, because it wouldn't be right to use child protection terminology or talking about harm and danger possibly at an initial contact at early help when we're trying to support possibly a teenage mother who's pregnant and she might need a couple of services. It would feel a little bit strong if we go in and start talking about harm and danger. So what we might talk about is worries and well-being or worries and success, and actually we're practicing the exact same model, but what we're doing is changing the terminology that fits the situation, that suits the needs of that individual that we're working with. The change could be called signs of well-being or success, it could be called signs of stability, it could be called signs of independence, it could be called signs of anything. The words are determined based on the person or the audience that we have. However, the practice approach and the practice methodology, the solution-focused way of working in partnership with families always remains. Working through the mapping and the analysis categories helps us to generate the worry weight statements and the well-being goals and scaling questions, and it's the grounding for the assessment and the future intervention. So we have a starting point when we develop a worry statement in partnership with children and families. We have a starting point, the very reason why we're supporting in the first place. But then we have a well-being goal, which is a success goal, where this is what we're working towards. This is what it would look like if we were no longer worried, or this is what it would look like if we withdraw our services. It's something we're creating a vision of hope, we're creating a goal that we need to work towards. What we know is that if families can't see a clear goal sometimes, or they don't know what they're working towards, then they don't necessarily fully engage or believe in the value of a plan. If there's clear descriptions of what success will look like or what well-being will look like, then families are more inclined to kind of work towards that because they can see the value and the payoff and what everybody's trying to achieve. Just to give an overview of signs of safety, because some people have asked us what the difference is between signs of safety and signs of well-being and success. So just some key points there about signs of safety. That the goal is always child safety. We've got this robust assessment identifying strengths, balanced with clear statements of risk. It's focused away from professionally imposed jargon and service-led planning, where we're telling families what to do, but it's much more family-led planning. It's a simple use of language. So again, we're getting rid of all the jargon, the words that don't necessarily mean anything, and we're using clear, accessible English when speaking to children and families. It can be applied in all settings as a solution-focused approach to promote change. And we know that relationships are everything. Remember when we said that it's a relational model, it's about forming and developing and maintaining strong working relationships with children and families. Practicing a stance of humility about what we think we might know about families, or some bias that we have, or some preconceived ideas about families, but practicing a stance of humility. A skillful use of authority. So although it's a strengths-based approach, at times we need to skillfully use our authority to kind of manage situations. So we don't always talk about everything that's going well. We do sometimes have to have the difficult conversations about the things that aren't going well. And it's using this skillful authority to know when the right times for those conversations need to take place. We recognise all families have signs of safety, and we maintain a belief in change. Change can always happen, and we maintain this belief that over a period of time, it may not happen in our time, it may happen in the family's time, which is right for that family, but we always maintain this belief in change. Always search for details and focus on creating small change. What we say is the more that changes that need to take place, the smaller the changes will be, so it doesn't become overwhelming. Prioritise what the key changes that need to take place in the immediate term, the mid-term, and then the longer term. So when there's more changes that need to take place, the actual changes are smaller. And as mentioned, we're always focusing on goals. There's a quote there by Andrew Tennell, who says, "It's a long day on the golf course if you don't know where the hole is." And he uses this analogy of somebody hitting a golf ball around but not really sure where the hole is, and then hand the club to someone else and they start whacking the ball around but not really sure where the club is. And it does feel like that sometimes when working with plans, because do we really know what success looks like? Do we really know what it will look like when we're no longer worried and we could close a case, for example? And quite often the answer to that is no. We're only working up to a point in time, maybe 6 weeks, 3 months, whatever the case may be. But we need to really create this goal for families about what future success and well-being or safety will look like. So an overview of signs of well-being and success. You could see this is almost identical. The difference being, when working with signs of well-being and success, that the goal is always child well-being. We have the same assessment, identifying the strengths based with the clear statements of worries. We are still focusing away from professionally imposed service-led planning and getting very much into working in partnership and in this relational way with families to come up with their own family-led wellbeing planning. Again, using simple language, so no overcomplicated words, no complex words that don't necessarily mean anything to families. They mean things to us, and sometimes we understand what each other means, but sometimes we don't even understand what one another means professionally. So families don't really have a good chance. So we're getting rid of that complex language that can feel confusing for families and can feel quite oppressive sometimes. It can be applied in all settings as a solution-focused approach to promote change. So again, signs of safety or signs of well-being or signs of success is all the same. The only thing that's changed is the terminology that helps to support and engage families and children at different levels of the service. Again, relationships are everything. We're practicing the stance of humility and the skillful use of authority. And it's recognising that all families have signs of well-being, bar none. Every family has something positive. There are extreme cases, I personally haven't heard of them, but there are extreme cases where possibly we would really find it difficult to find well-being. However, it's really important that we dig down deep and try and find this well-being, because we need to know it to balance our assessment. The families need to know it because it helps build their self-esteem and self-worth at the most difficult of times, and those well-being moments of well-being can actually become sustainable well-being in the long term if we can identify them and build upon them. We always maintain a belief in change, and we always search for details to focus on creating small change. So again, there's no difference there. And ultimately, we're always working on goals. So the same quote there from Andrew Tennell is about a long day on a golf course when you don't know where the hole is. So the changes between signs of safety and signs of well-being and success, as you can see, are minimal. There is really no change in terms of the values or the practice methodology or the practice principles. It's everything that governs how we work with families, how we engage with families, how we interact with children and families, and how we support them and work in partnership with them in a relational, solution-focused way. The tools could look different, and we can kind of change tools and approaches and methods of recording which suits that particular family or that unique set of circumstances. However, irrespective of what level of the service that we're working on, we're holding on to these same practice principles. So just to start looking at the three columns, which is the main assessment tool, if you like, within signs of wellbeing and success. And we have on the left what we're worried about, what's working well in the middle, and then what needs to happen on the right. In child protection in social work, or the original development of this tool, we talked about past harm. We're trying to identify from the past up until the present day what has been the harmful behaviours that causes us to be having this conversation or causes us to be worried today. The future danger's talking about impact. It's about, based on this harm, what do we think will happen, or what do we know has happened as a result of this harm. Complicating factors are things that make it more difficult to achieve success. There could be a range of things. We need to understand what the challenges or the barriers may be, but families also need to understand that we know what their challenges would be, so they could feel supported by that we acknowledge that they have difficulties and challenges. But it's very important that we identify complicating factors. Complicating factors don't necessarily equate to harm, because things can be difficult for families, such as mental health or such as substance misuse. However, it doesn't necessarily impact on children. So what we're trying to do in this column here is start separating out some of the worrying behaviours, what's actually a real cause for concern, or what actually is just a general complicating factor, something that needs to be addressed, but that doesn't necessarily equate to harm. In the middle column, we talk about existing strengths and existing safety. So existing strengths, everything that's positive, that improves the lived experience of the child and the family. And the existing safety is things that are present that ensure safety for that child. Then we're moving over to the safety goals in what happens next, and that's what we're working towards. And then the next steps is what we're going to do from this point onward to move into safety planning or move into any kind of work with children and families. So thinking about signs of wellbeing and success in assessment, where we talk about past harm in social work, we're talking about past wellbeing and success worries. The actual focus of the conversations is the same, however we've changed the terminology to suit the particular audience or the particular people or level of the service that we're working at. Future danger, we talk about future worries. Complicating factors remains the same because things are complicated irrespective of what level of the service that we work at. We talk about the current strengths, and we'll talk about the current well-being or success. So again, within that column, the focus is still the same. We're still applying the same analysis categories, however we're changing the terminology that fits, that suits that particular audience. We talk about well-being and success goals as opposed to safety goals, and then the next steps remains the same. And then down the bottom, we have the scaling, and the scaling is measuring our journey from the worry statement, which is the assessed need, to the well-being goal, which is the desired outcome. And then the journey in between that is the well-being planning. So once we've completed these three columns and applied all the 7 analysis categories, we will begin with our worry statement. That will help us to formulate a draft worry statement, which we will then present to the family and work in partnership with them till they take ownership. So that's our starting point. It's the very reason we're involved and our starting point. And then the well-being goal or the desired outcome is a description of what it will look like when we're no longer working with the family or no longer worried about the family, or that we've achieved well-being and success. The planning that comes in between that, again, is done in partnership with the children and families, and it's asking them to come up with their own solutions. So rather than us imposing solutions based on what we think we know or what we say is best for a family, we ask them, what do you think would be best in this situation? What can you do? Who could help you? Who could support you, etc. The wellbeing planning is the journey from worry statement to wellbeing goal, but it's very much owned and generated by the children and families that we're working with. So hopefully you can see there again, there is no difference between signs of safety and signs of well-being and success. The exact same mapping process with the 3 columns, the 7 analysis categories, and the worry statements and well-being goals and the scaling. The exact same practice approach is used. We're just changing the words to fit the audience or the people that we're working with at a different level of the service. And this is the signs of wellbeing and success assessment and support tool that was generated, and that's really just to help people. It's a bit of a crib sheet, if you like, or just a bit of practice guidance about the kind of focus of these particular analysis categories when working through assessment. So it's exactly the same as the previous slide, but this breaks it down a little bit more, and it kind of really gets down to the detail of what is it that we're asking when we're completing these 3 columns. So going back over to the past wellbeing, success and worries, we're thinking about what's happened in the past that's caused us to be worried. But be specific and factual and try and give examples and consider first, worst and last. What that means is that sometimes when families have been around for a while, there's lots of information and lots of things to tell, if you like. So rather than writing reams and reams and reams of all the worries that we have, try and be much more concise than that. So we might talk about the first incidents where we're worried. What was the worst time we were worried? And what was the last time that we were worried? So this gives us the chronicity of the worries, the severity of the worries and the frequency of the worries, and it helps us condense it into much more succinct assessments. Then in the future worries, based on the worries that we have, what are we worried will happen and what is the impact? It's not okay to say, well, I think this might happen or it suggests this might happen, because actually, how do we know? We need to be really thinking about evidence. We need to be really thinking about impact based on statements from children, statements from families, rather than having a hypothesis about what we think will happen. Because remember what I mentioned earlier about values and bias, this can sometimes very much come into play based on our own assumptions, our own values about particular behaviours. But actually, what evidence do we have? How do we know that things are going to cause well-being or success concerns for the future? Complicating factors, as mentioned, are the things that make it more difficult, or the barriers to the well-being goals. That could be things like mental health, it could be substance misuse, it could be poverty, it could be social isolation. Whatever the case may be, these complicating factors are real and we need to talk about them. As mentioned before, they may not necessarily equate to well-being and success worries. However, there may be general barriers or obstacles that we need to overcome in order for us to achieve our well-being and success goal. We're talking about the current strengths, so that's all the good things that are happening that improves the lived experience of the child. So all the positive things, all the things that are really good around relationships, around situations, around environment, around development, whatever the case may be. We really need to be focusing on this middle column, because it's the middle column that what's working well that promotes the change. These are the solutions that are generated out of this middle column. So we spend a lot of time thinking about strengths, so it's a much more balanced assessment. If we always focus on the left-hand column about the worries, that's a deficit model. But actually, and it's not a very balanced assessment, going back to what I said about every child and family in their home environment, there's something positive to talk about. They're doing something well, and it's really important that we unpick that and really talk about that and celebrate that in the middle column. And then the current well-being and success is around how some of the worries have been managed, some of the times when well-being and success has been achieved, and this may be from the past, it may be from the present, but we really need to kind of drill down on that, because that's the area that's going to consistently provide well-being and success in the longer term. And well-being and success can be generated out of current strengths. So if we find strengths and we build upon those strengths and then they're replicated 2, 3, 4 times, it evolves into current well-being and success. And this is what this particular approach is about. It's identifying the things that are good and trying to replicate those so we have a consistent well-being and success which is measured and tested over time. The well-being and success goals. So what will the family do and the network do and ourselves, etc. We're starting to think about what success will look like and where are we heading with this work. And then the next steps is agreeing what needs to happen next. What ideas do the family have? Certainly when I'm mapping with somebody, my next steps are what's going to happen. It's straight over to the family at this point. I might have a notion in my mind what I think needs to happen, but it's what the family and the network think needs to happen is important because it's their plan. So again, it's been giving ownership back over to the family and the network. It might include actions that need to be taken immediately in the immediate term based on the level of worries, and that's really kind of thinking about order of priority based on all this information we have that was presented in these 3 columns. What do we think is the most important thing to begin with, and what do we need to take action on immediately? It's trying to include next steps to start building a plan to explore with a network and thinking about getting together a network meeting or possibly a drafts, words and pictures explanation. But when we complete the mapping, it's really focusing on that network and strengthening the network. So in the beginning we might only have a couple of people, and if that's enough to manage well-being and success in the longer term, then that's fine. However, quite often it's not, and we need to think about over time, constantly focusing on those networks, constantly bringing people into the planning that can provide stability and well-being and success in the longer term. And all the actions need to be clear, descriptive and solution focused. So the actions, all of this is written in clear, accessible language. What Einstein talks about is when we're trying to explain something, is that if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old child, you don't understand it yourself. And what he means by that is sometimes we use these very complex jargonistic words that don't necessarily mean anything, but if we ask ourselves, well, what do I mean by that? Can I describe what I mean by it? It's sometimes quite difficult. Even as professionals, and we're using this language, so it will be even more difficult for families that we're working with. So it needs to be clear, plain English that's descriptive, but that's always solution focused. We're heading towards solutions. We're not focusing on the problem, we're focusing on the solutions. We have the worry statement, which is about who's worried, what behaviour they're worried about, and what the impact will be on the child. So which is the starting point. And then the well-being or success goal is who in the network needs to see change, what behaviours will have changed, and what it'll look like. Stating the positive impact for the child, and thinking about how long these changes need to be maintained until the case can close. Certainly sometimes when we're working with children and families, they don't necessarily want us in their lives. Sometimes they do, and that's great, but sometimes they don't. And we think about that if we think about ourselves. Somebody's coming into our lives and they're kind of very heavily involved in my day-to-day living. I might not necessarily want them there for any longer than they need to be. So we talk about, when we've achieved these wellbeing and success goals, about how long that would need to be maintained so we can close the case. So families have a clear picture in their mind about when it'll be that we'll exit and what that will look like. And then the scale in there, as we've mentioned, is creating a scaling question and trying to give a score from everyone's perspective to measure progress on the journey from a 0 to a 10. So as mentioned, just in summary, there's 3 columns in the assessment, and there's 7 analysis categories. It's important not to forget the 7 analysis categories because they are what turn the 3 columns into an analytical assessment of what's actually happening. 3 columns on their own and recording information into 3 columns or lists of information is very one-dimensional. It doesn't tell us anything, it's just list of information. And if you give that 3 lists of information to 3 different people, they would have 3 slightly different interpretations of what they think's happening, because we haven't used the analysis categories and really dug down to the analysis or really gone deep into actually things like the impact and things like the examples or things like the evidence. So it's really thinking about applying or not forgetting about those analysis categories, because they're very important. Because it's not an information gathering process, but it's a way of working through and analysing information to come up with solutions. So working through and completing a mapping with a family in the 3 columns and applying the 7 analysis categories is very different to having a conversation with a family, recording the information in the 3 columns and then going back to the office and analysing what we think it means based on a hypothesis that we have. It's different. We need to be working through those 3 columns and applying the analysis categories through relationships, through conversations when working with children and families. And it should be comprehensive, considering all available information and what it means for the children and families. So we ask lots of questions in Signs of Safety. Questions to children, questions to families, questions to teachers, questions to social workers, questions to aunties, uncles, questions to ourselves. We ask a lot of questions. Signs of Safety, as mentioned, is solution focused. It's rooted in a therapeutic model, a therapeutic relational way of working with people. We're always asking questions, and Andrew Tennell talks about if we step out of, if we stop asking questions, we've stepped out of using Signs of Safety, or in this case, if we've stepped out of asking questions, we've stepped out of using signs of well-being and success. We're always kind of exploring and asking lots of relational type questions. And thinking about the mapping and what I said there about statements sometimes being very dimensional, and what I mean by that is sometimes people record information which is good, but it doesn't necessarily mean what that means. And what I mean by this is we're not there just to gather information. An assessment, an early help assessment isn't there just to gather information. It needs to be analysed to understand what it means through our use of questioning, through our exploring with children and families their own unique circumstances. But most importantly, what does it mean for the child? So that's the impact, and that creates a what I would call a 3-dimensional statement. Because every statement must have a meaning, a purpose, and state what the impact is, so we can start thinking about solutions. And what I mean by this, an example this would be parents argue a lot in the home. I've seen this a lot on assessments, and it's a statement about that parents are arguing a lot in the home. That's the information, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything at this point. Parents argue, that's a fact of life. People argue, people disagree. And remember when I said if 3 different people looked at the same information, one person could say, well, so what? Parents argue, people argue. The other person would say, well, that's not really good that they're arguing a lot. The third person could say, well, actually, that could be domestic violence, or that could be a very frightening situation for the child or the young person. We don't know at this point. People are starting to form hypotheses based on what they think they know. So we need to be much clearer when we're formulating these statements. So that might evolve into parents argue a lot in the home and the children are frightened. So that's starting to change into something now, because we know that when the parents are arguing in the home that the children are frightened. How do we know this? We don't really know. The statement hasn't said this yet. It hasn't really told us about what the evidence of that is. It hasn't really told us about the frequency or the chronicity, or it still doesn't give us a lot of detail. It's talked about parents arguing in the home and that children are frightened, but again, it doesn't really tell us the full picture at this point. It's quite 2-dimensional. Evolving into parents arguing in the home and the children have said they are frightened, they've told us that they're frightened. This means that they may go on to feel worried, confused, nervous living at home, and they may feel unsafe and insecure. That is a much more rounded statement. That is much more descriptive in terms of the behaviour that's happening, what the impact is in the immediate term, but what the impact will potentially be in the future. That is what the early help assessment would look like in terms of the statements that are written in there. We describe the behaviour, but we're also describing the impact, and this is the so what, because as going back to the original statement, parents argue in the home, it doesn't tell us much, but thinking about going back into the green statement there, when in fact it's really evolved into something that we can actually start planning from. We have a thorough understanding of what that statement means, what that information means. So always thinking about this three-dimensional statements, what I call it, is we're presenting the information, but then we're presenting the impact on the child and the young person and what that means. This is getting to a much more analytical way of thinking. We're jumping straight into analysis at the earliest opportunity through our use of questioning, not through formulating our own hypotheses based on our own educational training. It's through asking the right questions to the right people. So our worry statement, where we start from, is a behaviour specific, straightforward description of what we're worried about and what we're worried will happen if nothing changes. We link it to evidence if we can, but it lays out the fundamental issues that any meaningful well-being or success plan must address, and it separates out concerns if they're more than one. So this is the structure. We've used an arrow at the bottom there. You will see on the left there in the red it says who's worried as part of the network of planners. Who is it that's worried in this situation, and about what actions or inactions. So it's about what behaviour. So what are they worried about? Like the time when is given evidence or an example of that, and then the impact on the child in the purple there is about this is the reason we're worried because of this impact. So if I read out this statement, it says, Katie the social worker, Susie the school nurse, and Mr. Lee the children's teacher are all worried that Mark and Jacob will continue to come to school dirty and wearing uniforms that don't fit properly. Like the time when they came to school on Friday the 16th of June in dirty shirts that were too short and dirty trousers that were too tight and too short. They're all worried that the children will stand out in school, and if children and the other children may not want to be friends with them or will make fun of them. If this happens, the children will feel unhappy and may grow up feeling that they're not as good as other people or may feel unhappy about themselves. So this is a typical situation, possibly in early help when we're working with people where there might be some concerns around neglect at home or boundaries or routines or whatever the case may be. But this is the statement that's been generated in this situation based on the specific worries about the children's presentation, if we want to call it that, at school. But rather than talking about we're worried about the children's presentation, what we are doing is describing what we mean by that. We're describing what poor presentation or worries about presentation look like. We're giving examples there where in the green they came on Friday the 16th of June and describing what that looked like. So that's giving the evidence or the example of this behaviour, if you like. And then going over into the purple there, we're describing what the impact will be. And again, not really complex terminology in terms of impact. It's impact that the family understand, that the network understands. So we talk about being unhappy. We talk about they're not feeling as good as other people. We don't talk about impacting on development or impacting on peer relations or impacting on all these complex terminologies that we use. We're trying to break it down into clear English that everybody, the children, the family and the network understands. And this is the formula that we use for structuring our worry statement. It's the same every time. It's the who's worried, what behaviour that they're worried about, try and link it to evidence like the time when, if you have, and then most importantly the impact on the child. So then moving over into our wellbeing or success goal, very similar format to the worry statement. And it links to the well-being or success goal links directly to the worry statement. So we have one well-being or success goal for each worry statement. And but what you're saying, if you were no longer worried, it's the end game and the possible time frame, and it kind of describes what success would look like or what well-being would look like, not necessarily how they'll get there. So we're not necessarily talking about services or what we think people need to do. It just talks about what the end game looks like. It describes that vision of hope. We're trying to get away from telling people what to do in a well-being or success goal. We're going to ask them what they think they should do. But what we do is create that vision of what well-being or success will look like. So you can see there the structure for wellbeing or success goals. Again, the formulas down the bottom there. So we're talking about who in the network of the plan needs to see the change, what those changes will look like, or what behaviours will have changed. So it's describing what those changing behaviours will look like. Talking about how it will improve well-being or success. So we're talking about the positive impact of these changes, and then thinking about finally for how long, how long we would need to see these changes maintained in order for us to no longer feel worried, and we can move the case on or close the case or whatever the case may be. But what we're talking about here is what success or what well-being will look like. And if I just read out that statement, it's the children's parents, Tom and Sue, the school and the network of family and friends agree to work together to show everyone that Mark and Jacob are always in clean, well-fitting uniforms when they start the day at school, and that they have washed before putting on their uniforms. This will mean that Mark and Jacob will not be upset in school, and they'll feel happy about themselves now and in the future. School and the network will need to see this working for a period of 3 months so that everybody is confident that the plan will keep working once the early help assessment closes. So again, there we're talking about who needs to see the change, but it's describing what those changes will look like, or describing what it will look like when we're no longer worried. It talks about the positive impact, about Mark and Jacob feeling happier about themselves now and in the future, and then it also talks about how long we would need to see these changes before we're confident that this will continue and the family and network plan will continue working and the case can close. And then thinking about how we measure this, so we talked about the journey from the worry statement to the wellbeing and success goal. It's about how we scale this journey, how we scale how worried we are today, but how we rescale how worried we might be in 3 weeks' time or 6 weeks' time or whatever the case may be. But a wellbeing or success scale, it's everybody's judgment on the level of wellbeing evident in a case. Each person will give an individual score based on their interpretation of the information. So we would ask scaling questions to the family, to the parents, to the network, to the school, possibly to the child, a young person, to our colleagues, whoever's actively involved in that early help assessment and planning, we would be asking the scaling questions too. But it's a measurable tool to help workers to focus on the judgment and analyse what needs to happen in order to move up the scale. So moving from the worry statement to the wellbeing goal. Scaling questions need to clearly define what 0 is and what 10 is, that are specific to the case. The scale is easier to interpret due to the numbering, so generally children and families understand 0 to 10. It's the most accessible way that has been developed to enable families and children to express where they're at through just a use of a number. Then there's conversations that are generated around that number, but generally the most accessible way to describe where people are at is a scale from 0 to 10. And they're also a useful way of obtaining new information and creating dialogue about new situations. So when we're using scaling questions and somebody gives a score, then based on their score it may have moved up or down the scale, but they'll always have a rationale for that. So it generates these conversations around why they've moved up the scale, why they've stayed the same, why they've moved down the scale. So actually sometimes through our use of scaling questions to review workers we're moving through from the worry statement to the wellbeing and success goal enables us to understand exactly what's going on at any point in time. Because the scaling question is the focus of the review. So we have a worry statement and a wellbeing goal and the scaling question that remain the same. However, the scoring and the conversations will change through the family action planning and review. So we've already completed our 3 columns with the 7 analysis categories and the scaling, and we've generated the worry statement and the wellbeing or success goal and then the scaling question. So we don't need to keep going over that assessment and remapping. When we're reviewing work, we have the clear descriptions of what we're worried about and what it'll look like when we're no longer worried, and then we have a scaling question that measures the journey or the distance travelled between those 2 points. This is the focus of reviews. So when we're reviewing any kind of work with children and families, we go back to the worry statement, thinking about the starting point, the well-being goal where we're heading towards, and then asking the scaling question about how far along that journey we are. And we'll review these scaling questions at each team around the family meeting for people to rescale and give the rationale for change. Because, as I mentioned, people will move up the scale hopefully, but people sometimes will remain the same, or some cases that people actually might move down the scale, but there'll always be a rationale for that. Nobody's wrong, but we unlock the rationale or the reason for that when we start asking questions around that score. As mentioned there, it might not always improve, but through our skillful use of questioning, we start analysing and understanding why things might not have improved and what we might need to do differently, or what the family might need to do differently, or the network, etc., etc. But if we scale high for a period of time and the plan's been tested, we may no longer need to focus on a particular worry statement or well-being goal, as that well-being and success has been achieved and sustained. So if a family are doing really well in a particular area, then there's no point keep going over that if it's been sustained for a period of time. We really need to focus our energies back on the things that possibly haven't changed, because we might have up to 4 worry statements and well-being and success goals. 2 of those have improved, and improvement's been sustained for a period of time. So let's focus on the 2s that haven't improved, because we know that change doesn't happen in isolation, and different things change at different times. This is totally normal. We wouldn't be expecting the whole thing to get better at once. And remember what I said earlier on about the more changes that need to take place, the smaller the steps should be. So it may be that you just focus on one particular area for a period of time, getting that improved and sustain for the longer term, and then actually we can refocus our energies into the different areas. Because once we've consistently reached high scores across the worry statement and well-being goal, we know that the family action plan is working, and then we can move on to discussing closing the early help plan and handing responsibility back over to the family in the network or single agency support. Remember that this is the family in the network's plan, it's not our plan. We support the family in the network generate their own plan through our assessment, through our skillful use of questions, and through our support. And what we're doing is, over a period of time, testing out their plan to see if their plan works, but supporting with them that. So if a family or network's plan's working, and then we're gradually withdrawing our need to kind of ask lots of questions or adjust the plan, we see that actually we've come to a final early help plan that's working, then actually there will be a point in time where we hand that over to the family in the network, and we can start withdrawing our support, or maybe going to single agency support. And then thinking about scaling, there is no wrong number. The number isn't as important as the conversation that it generates, because the score's subjective and it's based on a point of view around individual interpretation of the information. I have different background experience to my colleague through the training that I've had, or through the different work roles that I've had, or my own personal values, or my own personal experiences, or my own agency values. Whatever the case may be, will mean that ultimately I'll potentially score a very different score to my colleague, and neither one of us is wrong. We're just interpreting the information differently based on all those things that I've spoken about. But there's no wrong number. So if I score a 2 but my colleague scores a 4, neither one of us is wrong. What's important to understand is the rationale around that, because that'll start unlocking maybe some of my own understanding. Maybe after these conversations I'll move more towards where my colleague will be, because I start understanding it from their perspective. And this is the power of having these scaling type conversations, but asking about the rationale, because it really expands on the analysis based on people's perceptions and experiences and assessment. Because we would expect there to be a large range of scores, and as we spoke about there will be different levels of experience and values and understanding and analysis. No 2 people assess and analyse the same information exactly the same. There's a lot of things that come into play with that, but there's, as I mentioned, there's never no wrong number. because it's not the number that's significant, but it's the conversation around it. So when somebody gives me a score of 2, for example, I might say, well, why do you score at this number? Why do you score so high? What have you seen? What do you know? I'll start asking questions that unlocks further information around the analysis. And it's completely acceptable and often usual, as we know, for parents to score completely differently to us. And they're not wrong either, but they might view the situation differently to professionals. They might view it differently based on they live in that situation 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, all day, every year. So they're the experts in that situation. It may be that they're not wrong, they just view it differently because they have it balanced differently based on all the other information that we don't know about. It may be that we have certain bias that's causing us to think a particular way about a family. It may be, in fact, that the family genuinely don't understand that there might be worrying behaviours, or that generally might not understand our worries. There can be lots of different reasons for that, but just because a family score differently to us, it doesn't mean that they're wrong. The important part is asking the right solution-focused questions around that numbering and the rationale for that numbering, so it starts to unlock the analysis and what that really means. Because the numbers is just a starting point for a discussion around change. Because if you do understand the rationale, then you can begin to start asking questions around moving up the scale towards the well-being goal. And we can ask questions to one another, to families, to networks, to anybody really that are solution focused, and to begin to build a picture of what a well-being or success plan will look like and what is needed to make it a success. So in a scaling question, if I'd ask a scaling question, what I might follow that up with is, well, why do you score so high? If it's a 1, it's still high because there's some positive. It would be very unusual for somebody to score a 0, because what they would be saying is there is absolutely no strengths or positives whatsoever. Remember what I said earlier on about every family has some form of strengths. So we need to write our worry statements and well-being or success goals in a way that actually identifies that. But if anybody scores anything above a 0, it's always positive. So we would say, okay, you score a 1, so why do you score so high? And what are the best well-being factors to build upon? Might be our follow-up question. What would it take to get you one number higher? So thinking about small changes. Okay, so you're a 4 today. So what would a 5 look like? What would it take to get you there? What would a 10 look like? If we'd achieved that well-being and success goal, if that was a 10, then what would that look like? So trying to describe what success or well-being would look like. What are the main obstacles to moving up the scale? So this is talking about the complicating factors, things that make it more difficult, the barriers. And how can we remove the obstacles to create the well-being? So that's thinking about solutions to moving across or over these obstacles. What do you what do you need to help you achieve a 10? So that's asking whether it's the child or the family, what do you think that you would need to help you reach this 10, and the description of the 10 that you've given me. Who could help you achieve your goal? So that's thinking about who in the network or the professional network or whatever the case may be, who do they think they would need to help them achieve this goal? So you can see there that the number isn't just a number given and then it stops at that point. The number is the beginning of a conversation around change. In a solution-focused way, we start asking questions around how can we move up the scale, what will that look like, how do we get there, who will help you, etc., etc. So that kind of describes the whole purpose of a scaling question, and these conversations happen throughout our work with children and families. So we're constantly having these questions around moving up the scale towards well-being and success. And to move up the number, one number up the scale, what are our next steps? So again, thinking about small changes. Those aren't a script, these questions. They aren't the same questions that we'll ask with every single family. We need to spend some time asking the right questions and thinking about the right questions based on the unique set of circumstances of this individual family. So we would always ask, what would it take to move up the scale, but we ask it in different ways depending on that particular family they work with, and we will know the right questions to ask. But what we don't want to do is use the same script for every single family. We create and ask unique questions based on their unique set of circumstances. So there's an example of a scaling question which is for the worry statement and the well-being and success goal that we generated earlier in this presentation. So on a scale of 0 to 10, where 10 means that if we were to close the case tomorrow, we're confident that there's a plan in place to make sure that Mark and Jacob will always come to school in clean and well-fitting uniforms, which will make them feel more happy and confident. And 0 means that even with a plan in place, parents have not made good changes, and it's just a matter of time before they turn up in dirty clothes that are too small for them. Where would you scale today? So that's thinking about how far along are we from where we started to where we want to reach, or what we're trying to achieve. So this scaling question will be asked at each review, and people will give their scores, and then we'll start asking questions around those scores, the rationale for those scores, and start asking solution focused questions to move from the worry statement to the well-being or success goal. There's a brilliant statement there from David Cooperrider, who is the founder of Appreciative Inquiry, and what he says is we need to find the root causes of success rather than the root causes of failure. And this is very relevant when working in this practice methodology that we're working with signs of wellbeing and success, because nothing more can be gained from going over what families have done wrong, or everything that's gone wrong, or everything that's caused it to be a failure. What we do know is that we can unlock the change and unlock the well-being and success through focusing on the root causes of that success or well-being, the times when we weren't worried, the times when the families did ensure well-being and success, the times when they have done really well, and it's trying to understand those situations and the reasons why that was so, and then trying to replicate them, which will help us achieve well-being and success. And Albert Einstein there, another quote saying, we can't solve problems by using the same thinking we use to create them. So it's thinking differently, it's thinking differently about working with children and families and working through our planning with children and families. It's thinking about things in a positive and a strengths-based way. It's thinking about exceptions to the worries. It's thinking about the previous slide there. It's thinking about what are the root causes of well-being and success. Does that look like? What did it look like for this particular family? We're never worried about a family 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every day of the year. There are always times when well-being and success was present. So it's focusing on those times that will help us to identify what well-being and success will look like, but also identifying how we can sustain it. So we use solution-focused questions a lot, as mentioned. We use a lot of relationship questions in signs of well-being and success, because it's important to have everybody's perception, so we understand holistically from different people's points of view what the situation will be, because we know that different people see different things at different points in time. So we ask lots of relationship questions in signs of well-being and success. An example of that would be if the children's grandmother was to join us now, what would she say about the situation? If I asked Dad, what would he say about the situation? What would be the neighbour's biggest worry about the situation? We ask lots of questions about other people's perspectives. Impact questions. What have you seen that shows you the positive or negative result of what is happening? Very important questions, because we can have some information, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything unless we know that there's an impact. We can assume that there's an impact sometimes based on our bias or based on our preconceived idea or hypotheses we have. However, we need to be asking the right questions to determine if there is an impact of a behaviour. Exception questions, which we just spoke about recently, thinking about a time where this person had felt angry and wanted to lash out but didn't. How did they manage this? What did they do? So it's thinking about exceptions to those times when we're worried. So in this particular situation, there's somebody who's frequently getting angry and lashing out, but there was times when they felt angry but they didn't lash out. What was it about those? What was it about those times that enabled them to work through that in a good way, where it didn't cause any worries or it didn't cause any impact on the children? Coping questions, thinking about times when they felt like giving up but didn't. What was it about these times that gave that person the courage to carry on and deal with the situation? Very important when we're trying to raise people's self-esteem in very difficult situations, and they feel like there's no hope. We're trying to foster hope out of hopelessness, if you like. So thinking about coping questions to help them to understand that actually they can work through these situations, and what was it about these situations previously that enabled them to work through and cope in those difficult times. Miracle questions, thinking about what would good enough look like, or if somebody had one wish for the future, what would it be? Goal formulation questions, if you thought about how you would like things to be in 3 months' time, what would this look like and what would you see? What would it look like in 1 week's time? What would it look like tomorrow? What would it look like in a year's time? Whatever the case may be, we're always working towards a goal and trying to create that vision of the goal. And then the scaling questions, which we've already covered, on a scale of 0 to 10, where 10 means the problem's sorted out as well as can be hoped, and 0 means that the problem's so worrying we need to take immediate action. Where would you scale it? We can use scaling questions at any point in a conversation about somebody's readiness to change. So we have the scaling questions that are attached to the worry statement and the well-being and success goal. But if I was asking a person about maybe attending an appointment, which was an important appointment to them in terms of the health, for example, I might ask them, okay, on a scale of 0 to 10, 10 is that you're absolutely ready to go, you're already deciding what you're going to wear to that appointment, and 0 is you've got no intention of going whatsoever. Where would you scale it? They'll give a number, and then I can start having a conversation about what would it take to move up the scale to get you ready to go to that appointment. So we can ask scaling questions at any moment in time to try and measure where people are at and then talk about solutions to change. So remember what we said, networks is a bottom line in signs of safety. So we need to be exploring networks with parents and carers at the earliest opportunity. Because time needs to be invested with parents and carers at all levels to ensure that the naturally occurring support mechanisms are in place. This is right from the very first moment in time that we ever meet a family that come into services for whatever reason. So this is right the way from early help right the way through social work and beyond. But the whole idea or the whole ethos and practice methodology of this model is that we're supporting families to come up with their own plans in a solution focused way, supported by the people that are important to them, that are naturally around them, that are there when we aren't there. So we always need to be exploring networks of parents and carers at all levels of the service. What we know is if we can get good networks around families in crisis or people in crisis, then quite often things don't escalate to a point where they need to move into a different service or move into social care, etc., etc. We know that if we're getting networks and strong networks around people at the earliest opportunity, it's preventing some of these more difficult or crisis situations in the future. We've spoke about a genogram. It's a useful way to begin to start unpicking work with children and families and to start understanding who's important and who's not important, in fact. And we often find that sometimes it's not direct blood relatives that are the most important people to children and families. It might be friends, or it might be friends' parents, or it might be a local shopkeeper, whatever the case may be. We're not sort of specifying that it needs to be direct blood relatives that need to be supporting families. It can be anybody that's important to them. We also need to think about the impact of shame, guilt, denial and family dynamics. Very powerful feelings, emotions, circumstances that surround trying to encourage networks, shame being the biggest of those, because people don't generally want to talk about their issues, if you like, with other people. However, we need to find a way to support families to work through some of these feelings to help them to understand that we're there to support them, and we want to bring other people around them to kind of hold them and support them through these difficult times. Because parents and carers are the experts of their relationships and experiences of these. So sometimes they will say and tell us that they absolutely will not have a particular person involved in their life, and that's okay. But we would say, well, who else then? Who else can you bring forward? We need to keep digging down and digging down and digging down until we find enough people to help support with the planning and the ongoing well-being and success of the child and the family that we're working with. Because Tennelle talks about it takes a village to raise a child, and there's some quotes there from Steve DeShazer, who's the founder of Brief Solution Focused Therapy. He talks about the issues parents have with bringing forward support people are not resistance. They reveal the exact reasons for past problems and why they've happened, and present fantastic opportunities to dig into those issues with families and parents. And we need to distinguish if it's our issue or theirs. Is our thinking getting in the way of them possibly finding support people? Do we say that they have no one? Do we say that the people they have are all problematic or burnt out or won't help, etc.? Resistance is dead. So what that means is, are we sometimes a barrier to successful well-being and success planning with families based on our own opinions, understanding, bias, etc.? We can have people in a family and a network plan, if they're important to this family and network, that we might not necessarily agree with based on some of their behaviours or some of our experiences with that particular person. But people can help practically. People aren't necessarily involved in the direct care and protection or safety of a child or well-being of a child, but they might be involved in the periphery around the practical support about giving lifts to mums or giving lifts to dads or going to the shop or etc. etc. We shouldn't automatically exclude people based on their behaviour or our bias or preconceived ideas around that, because what families are telling us is these people are important to me. They are in our lives, and they will be in their lives once we've closed the case or we're no longer around. So actually, does it not make more sense to try and work with these people rather than trying to close them out? Because the reality is we never are going to close them out. They will always be around there, and they will always be part of these people's lives because they've told us this. So we try as much as possible to work with people irrespective of some of our feelings or some of our judgments or experiences of these families. So thinking about some of the questions that we might ask to start exploring networks, we ask questions about past relationships. Who have you relied on when things got crazy in your life? What were the most important things they did for you? Who have you called on to care for your children in the past? Thinking about present people or people that are around at the moment. Who in your life do you wish had been there when I knocked on your door? Who will be the first person you call when I go? If you won a big award, who are the 5 people you would want to be there? Thinking about future. Tomorrow, if you were in a serious accident and ended up in a coma, who would you want the doctor to call to take care of the kids until you got out? Who will you invite to your next birthday celebration? And then if there's a bit of difficulty there establishing people and the parent or the carer saying that they don't have anybody, you may ask, if you did have people to support you with the children, what would you want them to do? What would be the most helpful for you? Or what might it mean for the judge, my manager, etc., if you found some people to support you? These questions aren't a script. There's literally thousands of network questions based on the unique set of circumstances of that family that you're working with. But we're thinking about trying to find people that are around at the moment, but that may not be around at the moment, people from the past that people have lost contact with, people who could potentially strengthen relationships with, who can be around in the future. We're not necessarily talking about the here and now, and we're not necessarily talking about the direct blood relatives either. If you think about the average sort of life path or trajectory of a person from birth to where they are present day, thinking about all the places that they've lived and all the schools that they've gone to, all the clubs they've been to, all the social situations that they've been in, all the friends that they have on Facebook and social media, all the people that they talk to when they go to the shops, etc., etc. There are always people around if you think about it in that kind of scale. We need to ask ourselves, are we spending enough time exploring networks? Because a network member doesn't necessarily even need to be in the same locality. Part of that support plan can then be being around on the end of the phone when mum needs to vent or dad needs some space or whatever the case may be. So it doesn't necessarily have to be people that are in the direct family or even in the direct community. It can be people from further afield that can be involved in our planning with children and families, but we really need to spend a lot of time on establishing networks at the earliest opportunity, because what we do know is if we establish these networks at the earliest opportunity, it does prevent escalation, it does prevent future crisis, it does provide support at the earliest opportunity to help children and families work through some of these challenges they're experiencing. So thinking about our team around the family meetings, once we've established these network members, then they need to be involved in the TAF meetings, because the decisions and the future planning with the family requires that these people be around, because it's not our plan, as we mentioned, but it's the family and the network's plan. So if a plan involves somebody, then isn't it important that they're at this meeting? And we're trying to get away from professionally imposed plans to much more family and network generated plans. So it's important that we have these people around at these meetings because they're part of the planning. It's not our plan that we've imposed and asked them to do, it's their plan that they've generated and we're testing it over time. So we need to involve these people at the earliest opportunity and all the communications that affect their plan. And there may have been network members that are involved but only on the periphery, which we've already discussed. They're not directly involved in the early help action plan, but for these network members, they might not need to know all aspects of the case, they might not need to be involved in all of the meetings or all of the communications. However, they will need to have an awareness about the plan that involves them. And an example of that would be somebody that lives, 300 miles down the country, but they're somebody that mum can ring on a Friday night when she needs to let off steam and just vent about her frustrations about a given situation. It will be unrealistic to get them up to a TAF meeting. We may be able to include them online through some kind of media communication, such as Teams or whatever the case may be, or Skype. However, they might not always need to be there. The people that are really important are the people that are involved in the care and protection or the well-being and success of the child. So there may be people that are on the periphery that they may not need to know everything and they may not need to be involved in all of the meetings. However, they do still need to be included in communications in terms of what part of the planning affects them. But it's thinking a little bit differently about our TAF meetings, that actually a TAF meeting needs to evolve into much more of a family and a network meeting as opposed to a professionally imposed or directed meeting. So moving forward, because early help is key to preventing escalation, unless it's absolutely necessary, keeping more children and families with the naturally occurring networks when it's safe to do so. So we spoke about that right at the beginning in terms of the whole vision for our implementation of this practice methodology in Cumbria. It is about keeping children and families at home and connected when it's safe to do so. And early help is actually key to that. It's key to the escalation, or it's key in terms of preventative work for families moving up into crisis points. It's stopping that at the earliest opportunity by establishing these networks, by establishing support at the earliest opportunity. Families will receive the same service experience in practice, whatever level of the service they're at. So whether it be early help or social work or some of our third sector partners, they will experience this same practice methodology, this solution focused way of working where they're in control of their own plan. And the local authority in Cumbria is developing a strengths-based solution focused practice methodology throughout all its services. So there will be an expectation of all services eventually. We're on the journey in terms of a large implementation of signs of safety, and the changes to the early help assessment, which go live 1st of September 2020, is part of that. It's part of the early help assessment evolving into this way of working, so we can all support families in a much more meaningful way, in a solution focused way. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. I hope it's been helpful in terms of supporting you with the changes to the early help assessment, and please feel free to dip back into the assessment whenever you want, into the presentation whenever you want, and you can kind of review it and then just go over and see if there's any other pointers where you need to revisit, just to kind of help to understand the new changes that are taking place. Thank you for your time. Take care.